What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture. It's a place of history. It's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution.
For the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg, for me, is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Oh, go ahead and clap for that. Both of them. Welcome, family and friends, both in person and online. This program is being live streamed. Welcome to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. I'm Casey Matthews, Deputy Director. On behalf of our Director, Joy L. Bivens, our staff, and our volunteers, it's my pleasure to greet you and to greet this exciting book launch here in person with Ms. Alelia Bundles. The unveiling tonight of Joy Goddess, Alelia Walker, and the Harlem Renaissance is one of our Schomburg pre-Centennial Festival events. Our Centennial Festival is this Saturday, June 14th, from 11 to 5. We'll be on 135th Street. There'll be programs inside the building and out. This is a combination of our annual literary festival, which takes place around the Juneteenth period, encompassing also our Black Comic Book Festival. There'll be food, readings, books, book signings, things for all ages. And this year we're going to, instead of ending at 5 o'clock, we're going to roll until about 7 o'clock. We're going to have some celebrity DJs come and play for us on the block. As you know, as you can tell from our video, this is the Schomburg Centennial. 100 years of collecting, preserving, and sharing the richness of Black history and culture. We opened a new exhibition in May titled 100, A Century of Collections, Community, and Creativity. There's a new library card that features the Schomburg Center, and you can pick it up at any of the branches in Manhattan, Staten Island, or the Bronx, all parts of New York Public Library. And we've published a new online curriculum, The Life and Legacy of Arturo Schomburg. The lesson is designed for teachers of grades 6 through 12, and it joins 6 other lessons that we've already created, and they are online for free. It's part of a series called Teaching with the Schomburg Center Archives, and it's focused on 3 broad themes: Black power, slavery and abolition, and Black women's studies. We actually wrote the grant to do this before the pandemic, and obviously there were some delays in getting this done. This is not the sort of thing that I think we could have conceived and written a grant for in this particular time frame. So it is very, very important work, and please remember, it is free and online. All one has to do is go to Schomburg Center's website and look for the Schomburg curriculum. Our website is schomburg.org/100. It's very easy to go to. For anyone who's been in the classroom, for anyone who's taught youngsters, you realize the importance of primary sources. I'm sure Ms. Bundles, and educators like our conversationist tonight will tell you that primary sources are important to be able to help teach our youngsters the truth of things. I want you to take a moment to please silence your phones. During the presentation tonight, please no flash photography, and I ask that you not film. This is being live streamed and will live on YouTube forever, we certainly hope. And following the conversation, there's going to be a Q&A. Please be respectful of our presenters so that when you come up for the Q&A, please ask a question and let them give you the answer. Our microphones are in the back behind the orchestra seats. The moderator for tonight's program is Dr. Deborah Willis. Yeah. Dr. Willis is chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU. She's also the director of NYU's Center for Black Visual Culture and the Institute for African American Affairs. A MacArthur and Guggenheim Fellow, she's pursued a dual career as an art photographer and as one of the nation's leading historians of African American photography and curator of African diasporic cultures. And our featured speaker this evening should be no surprise to any of you. In addition to being the author of Joy Goddess, Ms. Bundles is the author of New York Times' notable book and bestseller, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker. This book was a Black Caucus of the American Library Association Honor Book, a Hearst and Wright Foundation Legacy Award finalist, and the Association of Black Women Historians Letitia Woods Brown Prize winner. Ms. Bundles is a former ABC News Washington, D.C. Deputy Bureau Chief and an Emmy Award and DuPont Gold Baton winning television news producer. Please join me in welcoming Alelia Bundles.
Thank you, Casey. And as Casey knows from multiple emails that started many months ago, this is the place where I wanted to launch Joy Goddess. It is only steps away from where A'Lelia Walker moved to New York in 1913, and it is at the corner of Madam C.J. Walker, A'Lelia Walker Place and Lenox Avenue. And Deb and I will talk about how we met. I just thank you all for coming. We were sitting here on the stage, and Kevin was trying to have us follow protocol and said, don't you want to go backstage and make an entrance? But Deb lived in this building for a long time, so this is like a living room. And then when I saw so many friends coming in, I really couldn't go backstage. So anyway, I see my editor, Kathy, and I don't see Rebecca. But anyway, I won't mention everybody in the audience because I would go on, but I do have to say my childhood friend Daryl Pinckney is here, and thank you, Daryl, for coming. So I like to start, this really is the first night I'm doing this, but my idea is to start with some images of A'Lelia Walker, and there we go. Okay, we get past the title. And it's coming. Don't you like my font? It's very 1920s. Okay, I'm hitting this and the folks in the... Okay, there we go. Okay, we need to go back one. All right, so Deb and I are gonna have a conversation because she's known me since I first started doing this research, but I just really wanted to set the tone because I don't think it's possible to really understand A'Lelia Walker until you see her. And so the reason A'Lelia Walker had the fortune that she had to have the Dark Tower and to have the great parties that she had during the Harlem Renaissance was because her mother, Madam C.J. Walker, a name known to many of you, built a beauty empire, became a millionaire, was a philanthropist, and it was really her desire to make her daughter's life better that motivated her. And she started by developing Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower that healed scalp disease at a time when most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing and electricity, so people had really bad dandruff and they needed an ointment that would heal that scalp disease. And so you can see the before and after. She was very effective at advertising and at marketing. This is her vegetable shampoo and her wonderful hair grower. So these are good. I'm just going to do captions so that we can get to the conversation, but I'm hoping that these images kind of set the tone for you. Madam C.J. Walker, motivated by wanting to make her daughter's life better, really lifted herself up from being a washerwoman until she was 38. By the time she died in 1919, she was 51 years old, living in a mansion in Irvington, New York. But here they are together. They have come up from the tenements of St. Louis, and now they are with their chauffeur. And A'Lelia Walker, Madam Walker founded her company in 1906. A'Lelia helped develop the company when they were in Pittsburgh and Indianapolis. And while A'Lelia was running the Pittsburgh office, she and Madam Walker had moved to Indianapolis in 1910. She persuaded her mother that they needed to be in Harlem, just as Harlem was becoming the mecca of Black culture and politics. And you can see she was always just very flamboyant, very charismatic. And I'm lucky to have these photos because my family, we could say that members of my family are archivists. Some people might say pack rats. But as a result, I have these incredible photos. And why this is not going, I do not know. That says on. Oh, here we go. Okay, so that is the house that used to be where the Count Cullen Library is. It would never have been torn down now. The salon inside. The beauty school, that's A'Lelia in the front, seated. And then when Madam Walker moved to New York, her personal residence to New York in 1916, and that beautiful townhouse was not big enough for 2 women. And so she had the same architect, Vertner Tandy, design this beautiful mansion for her, which is still standing. This was the music room. Both women loved music. Even when they were poor in St. Louis, music was all around them. Madam Walker had been Sarah Breedlove, the washerwoman, had a good enough voice to be in the choir at St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. where the women of the church began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. They lived across the alley from Tom Turpin's Rosebud Cafe, where Scott Joplin played. Madam Walker's brothers were barbers, and barber shops were places where musicians gathered. So music was around them all the time, and when they became wealthy, they hired the best musicians to perform at their parties. Many of their friends, the people who were most mobile, who traveled just as they did when they were developing their business, were musicians like Bert Williams and Ada Overton Walker. This is Madam Walker and Alelia Walker. I just wanted to show this, both of them in their furs, because they both love furs. Madam Walker dies in 1919, and I see Susan Olsen and Meg Van Trudeau from Woodlawn Cemetery, where Madam Walker is buried. Thank you. Alelia Walker becomes the president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. She's here with the great C-suite that Madam Walker created. In 1924, the Walker agents had their national convention in New York. They visited Woodlawn, and then they went to Villa Laurel for a picnic and a tour of the house. One of the other major events that happens in the book is my grandmother May's wedding in 1924. You can see May is not very happy. When you read the book, you will understand why. But it was a gorgeous wedding. And here she is with the groomsmen. They were all doctors, lawyers, dentists, businessmen, the black elite. And then Alelia Walker is very much a part of the Harlem Renaissance. She turned the 3rd floor of her townhouse into the iconic Dark Tower, which we'll talk about. This is the invitation to the Dark Tower. The menu, again, I have archivists. My family members were archivists. They saved all these things. My favorite item on this menu is Alelia Walker iced tea. Now, it was Prohibition, so I don't know what was in the iced tea or what people might have put into the iced tea. And it's Alelia Walker in the music room at Villa Laurel. Deb and I will talk about this. This is an R.E. Mercer. These are R.E. Mercer photos. Deb, of course, is the expert on the history of black photographers. And I don't think Casey mentioned that you are a MacArthur genius, but I am so proud of you. When Alelia Walker died in 1931, people lined the streets of Harlem. There were crowds outside the funeral home for 2 days, waiting in the rain, and then this is the crowd. And then the body was taken to Woodlawn Cemetery. There was a famous pilot, black pilot, Hubert Julian, who flew over the cortege as they went to the cemetery. And at the cemetery, he dropped flowers onto the grave. So this was a grand funeral and a very interesting life. So Deb. Okay. We're ready.
So I'm just going to read a note that I wrote in response to the book. And I said that Joy Goddess has transformed the idea of an heiress through the writing of Alelia Bundles, who tells a dazzling story that is most often overlooked in framing a history of beauty and business. It is a graceful and fast-paced story that guides the reader to imagine a life of a black woman who lived a sensational life that incorporated internationalism, beauty, wealth, and freedom. The only daughter of the first black woman millionaire, Madam C.J. Walker, Alelia championed the business of her mother, that her mother built. It is a hypnotic, when you have a chance to pick up the book, it is a hypnotic read. And it embraces class, struggle, life, and deceit during the first quarter of the 20th century. She was friends with, we all know, Langston Hughes and Carl Van Vechten and respected members of the Harlem community. This book honors the memory of a dreamer who dedicated her life to challenge convention through fashion and created a new vision of the in crowd during the Harlem Renaissance. A patron of the arts, she was described by Marvell Cook in this way: people flocked about her like bees swarm to flowers. So it's engaging to have this experience, and I loved every page, so it's really an honor to be here. And I said, what a joy it is, and I mean truly a joy to be here with Alelia Lili, my friend, and to share this amazing book, Joy Goddess. I am also honored to be here at Schomburg, where I started my career in 1980 and met you during those years as we began to think about how to unpack the archive. And I'd like to thank Casey and Joy and the Schomburg team for the invitation to share this moment with my dear friend. So my first question you kind of answered when you organized your slides, but I want to ask you, who taught you how to love the archives?
So my papa, my grandfather, was really the one. When A'Lelia Walker died in 1931, my grandparents moved her belongings to Indianapolis. My grandmother died in 1945 when my mother was a freshman at Howard, and I was born in 1952. June 7th, it was just my birthday.
Happy birthday.
But when I would, so when I would visit the apartment with my mother where my grandfather lived, where my grandmother's belongings were, I would sneak off to a dresser drawer in her bedroom. And inside that dresser drawer, I found mother of pearl opera glasses and ostrich feather fans. And the thing that excited me most were these really miniature mummy charms that I later learned A'Lelia Walker had bought in Cairo in 1922. So that was the archive. I mean, I was finding the archive. And my grandfather supplemented that because he cared a lot about history. He was born in 1892. He was very proud of his family. The Walker family was my grandmother's family. But his family, his father had gone to Lincoln, was valedictorian of his class in the 1880s. His mother had gone to Oberlin. His grandfather had been elected to state office in Arkansas during Reconstruction. So he was telling me that history, and he had saved things. He had clippings from the 1880s, and he had all of this material. And I remember him opening up a trunk. So when I was starting to do, I know this is a long answer, but all of these. But when I was starting to really do my research for On Her Own Ground, I visited him. He had moved back to Arkansas where he grew up. And I said, Papa, there was a trunk that you had in the apartment. Where's the trunk? And he said, well, it's in the closet in the front bedroom. So I dragged the trunk out. The key was long lost, but we got the locksmith to come, put the trunk in the middle of the living room, and he was sitting in a straight back chair. He was almost 90 at that point. And we started going through it, and I pulled things out, and there were A'Lelia Walker's wedding license from her second marriage with the baby's breath still in it, her negligee, my grandmother's wedding, the underslip for the wedding dress, and all kinds of documents. So that's how I learned to love the archives.
Great, thank you. And I recall our first meeting at the Schomburg in the historic building some
I don't know
years.
how many, I don't know, sometime in the 80s.
Yeah, it was in the 80s. And you were researching the first book. But how did you know that this was another book in the making at that time?
When I was writing On Her Own Ground, I thought I was doing a double biography. And I realized, and I wanted to develop the relationship between mother and daughter because that's so central to their motivations and the decisions that they make. And about halfway through researching and writing, because those things go hand in hand, I realized that A'Lelia Walker needed her own book. And I'd actually written a paper about her in high school because she was more interesting to me than Madam Walker at that point, or at least more accessible. I know that doesn't make sense to people, but it made sense to me as a high school student. But I realized, and then I wanted her to have her own, sort of moment in the sun. But I also knew that most of what I read about her in other people's books was really inaccurate. Langston Hughes got it right in The Big C, when he's the one who gave me this title because he called her the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s. But so much of what had been written about her was a caricature, that someone said, oh, she played bridge, all she did was play bridge during the 1920s. Well, nobody's that pathetic. But she did like bridge and she did like poker. But she did all of these other things.
But to think about, how did you develop this book? I mean, it has such a narrative in terms of the table of contents. I was trying to how you began to set the stage. We know the stories we've heard about from different writers of the period, but how did you set the stage of Harlem, and why A'Lelia set her salon during the Harlem Renaissance? What was the environment that you found where the artists and the men in the community would want to spend time in the Dark Tower? What was missing, what was lacking, what was needed?
But one of the things that people who are here who know Harlem know this, but many people just think Harlem is it's a Black place. But it evolved into this Black cultural mecca. That when A'Lelia Walker bought a building in 1913, it still was predominantly white. And the block she moved onto still was predominantly white. But over time, over that next decade, once Black people moved into a block, white people moved out of the block, and that just happened over that decade. So I wanted to show that evolution of the neighborhood. And as she bought this house in 1913, by 1924, the population really had changed, and 135th and Lenox was starting to be very commercial and very noisy. And so she got an apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, like just a small apartment, because she wanted to have a private space, and this building was really commercial. And she started renting out some of the space for private parties, for receptions, for fraternity and sorority events, for wedding receptions. And then by 1925, 1926, as a lot of these young writers were starting to get books published and they were starting to do their artwork, she had this idea that she wanted to create a space where they could come hang out. And some of it was a variety of things. She always had loved music, and many of the musicians who were closer to her age, like Burt Williams and some of the others, I mean, and James Reese Europe, another very famous musician of the time. But the writers were a little younger, so they weren't really her contemporaries to hang out. But she wanted to do something for them. And I think some of the seeds that were planted, she'd always had books by Black authors in the beauty salons in Harlem and in other places around the country in the other beauty salons. But she also had spent time at Tuskegee at the Veterans Hospital. Her third husband was number 2 at the Veterans Hospital, and she hung out with a woman who was a librarian who had actually been at the Schomburg for a while, but had been hired to create the library at the Veterans Hospital.
Wow,
and she saw that sort of what we call bibliotherapy, because many of the men who were there in the hospital had, mental health problems. So I think she saw this moment where she could, be the patron of the arts that she wanted to be.
It's fascinating when we think about this moment. I grew up in a beauty shop, as you know, and books were a part of that story of magazines and Ebony and all of the magazines that you can imagine. But then also we think about how Tiffany Gills describes beauty shops as subversive places, and how education is explored within these subtle ways. But also the fun aspect of it, what I thought fascinating when reading the book is with Jerry Majors, right, where she says and writes in the Tatler. But I also think about how page 6 today in the Post, that this is the same experience of this vibrant community that was part of the experience of her work in this community.
I want to say something about Jerry Majors. So some of you of a certain age will remember Jerry Majors' name because she was the society columnist for Jet for many, many years. But during the 1920s, Jerry Major was known as Geraldine Dismond, and she was the society columnist for 3 or 4 different Black newspapers, as well as the publisher of the Tatler, which was a kind of a gossip sheet, but also had news. And thank goodness the Schomburg had microfilm. I mean, it's been 25 years since I looked at that microfilm, but she told what was going on. Well, A'Lelia Walker was, 2 of her best friends were Geraldine Dismond, later known as Jerry Major, and Bessie Bearden, Romery Bearden's mother, who also was a society columnist. So that meant I knew what people were wearing, what they were drinking, what they were doing at their parties every week, because these women wrote about her. And I had the good fortune of interviewing Jerry in the early 80s. And she was living in the Riverton. I just have to tell you this. Living in the Riverton, and at that point she had vertigo or something, so she was, you know, she was in her bed in this beautiful white satin bed jacket, and her hair is this sort of beautiful white halo. In another room, she had all of her address books and file cabinets of the people that she knew. And we just talked about the times when they hung out together, you know, that they would go off to Atlantic City, or they would go off and have a good time. And it was wonderful for me to be able to interview people who were A'Lelia Walker's friends and have the real story from them, as opposed to sort of a recycled secondary source description of what was going on.
Did you photograph her? And
you know, it was before, and I wasn't you. I think I did audio tape.
No, but I see the
yes,
satin.
yes, I needed to have those photographs.
But I recall, in terms of the photographs that you shared with us today, but also the rediscovery of the photographs that you found not only in your grandfather's trunk, but through the Schomburg. Just images from Vanderzee, images of the Dark Tower, but also when all of you purchase a couple copies of the book, you'll notice that there are stories within the photographs. And so I was curious, how did photography inspire your research?
Yeah, both Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker were very aware of the power of the image. I mean, that before and after photograph of Madam Walker is showing before she used her wonderful hair grower, and then after her hair had grown. And that's, you know, we know that like the Jenny Craig commercials now. So they understood the power of photographs. And you can see from those early photographs of A'Lelia Walker that she was photographed a lot. You know, she hired people to do the photography. And it's interesting to me, there are no Vanderzee photos that I'm aware of that A'Lelia Walker commissioned. There are a couple of photos that she's in that were taken by him, and there are a couple of photos in the building, in the Dark Tower building that he took. But her favorite photographers were Robert E. Mercer and James Allen. Those are the people she commissioned to take pictures of her grandson, to take pictures in Villa Laurel, to take pictures of my grandmother May's wedding. So I don't know what the relationships were.
That's another research project.
Yeah, and it's another research project.
But again, the inspiration. What inspired you to reimagine her life through the chapters? Like you have a title, Chapter 1, Guest of Honor. How did you move through the chronology through love and loss, a funeral, and a wedding? So they're really poetic titles, but I'm curious, Guest of Honor, what did that mean to begin a chapter? Chapter 1 is a guest of honor.
You know, some of this, I think the chapter titles are just kind of organic, and I was feeling it, and I'm looking at Kathy Belden and Rebecca Jett, my editors, who kept me from going off into crazy tangents. But I was trying to really capture what was going on. So Guest of Honor is the opening chapter, and I wanted to set the tone to describe the relationship with Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker, to say, you know, how in some ways they were devoted to each other, but they also had a really complicated relationship where A'Lelia Walker wanted, as I say, the best of everything for her mother. And so Madam Walker was the guest of honor. And this is 1914. A'Lelia has been in Harlem for about a year, and she's trying to persuade Madam Walker to move to New York. And so she assembles this amazing group of Harlem leaders. It's Fred Moore, who's the publisher of a black newspaper, James Reese Europe, who was the most well-known black musician of the time. And I wanted to sort of create that mood where we see how she's trying to please her mother.
And just the idea of, you talked about the menus and other personal items, but her personal diaries, how did that shape her internationalism in this woman of the world? How did you find inspiration? Because we talked about her trip to Egypt and to Paris, and you know, all of us have our dream of traveling in that way, but just imagine this time period in her life.
Right.
How did you reimagine that?
It was Eat, Pray, Love. I mean, it was that kind of thing. She had, she had married someone that her mother didn't want her to marry, and it didn't work out. You'll get details in the book. And then her heart was broken, and she really decided that she was going to go on a trip. Now, a business trip she was going to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and she might develop some business. But it really was kind of a self-discovery trip. But I have to tell you this backstory. Finding these things in my grandfather's apartment, when he moved back to Arkansas, he put a bunch of stuff in storage in Indianapolis, and he didn't pay the bill. So I thought, well, you know, I'm really lucky to have what I do have, but there's a lot of things I'll never see. And fortunately, the people who owned the storage company are family friends, the Stewarts, who Daryl will recognize, Tony Stewart. And Tony was kind of downsizing, and he started sending me, like every other month, a box of things that he found in the back of the warehouse. And one of the boxes came with an autographed copy of The Weary Blues by Langston Hughes and A'Lelia Walker's travel diary from this trip in 1921 and 22. And so, and I knew she had been there. There were newspaper articles, there were letters. I was trying to piece things together, and lo and behold, in that first page it says, and on the first night in Paris, I had dinner with Louis and Antoinette Mitchell, a very famous musician, and Antoinette Mitchell, the daughter of a very well-known African-American minister. And so I didn't have to make it up. I mean, you know, I don't make stuff up. I'm like really serious about, I don't put it in there unless I can document it. But that just told me what I believed instinctively. And then she went to Nice, where she had made a number of friends. She made friends on the ship. She was, of course, in first class on the SS Paris. J.P. Morgan's daughter was also in first class, but she made friends with a French woman, Madame Juvenal, and had dinner with her in Paris. And then everywhere along the way, she met other well-known people or just people who were very nice to her. And so she did have a great time. She then went to Cairo, to Palestine. She visited the Empress in Addis. You know, so she had a grand time.
She had the grand tour. But we're thinking about the way you tell the story. It's so unusual, where there's like the, you know, not the rag to riches, you know, old time story that we all know. And that's where her ease in all of these places that she has been able to travel. And I was trying to see if you could tell, how did you realize this was an important story to tell today? Because she was doing important things then in the 20s. But you introduce a broad range of her life that includes her interest in art history, fashion history, and romance. So let's talk about how these moments merge, you know, from a heartbreak. How do you redress these stories through the diary, but also through a Black woman during this time period? So,
I mean, she was larger than life, and she really is, without exaggeration, I think, the first Black heiress celebrity. You know, she, you know, you think about who, you know, who's sort of it's maybe Nepo babies is the way people would say it now. But there were other Black people who had wealth before Madam Walker, of course. But I don't know of any other person who was just like the celebrity, but who had the charisma that she had, who had the personality to draw other people to her, but who also really loved music and theater, and had lots of friends who were in those worlds. And I think that's what sort of helped set the tone.
So you're recognized as a journalist, and that really comes across in the way that you research. I was curious about how the legacy of the Walker dynasty in your work and the merge of the business. I remember you shared family stories, and just curious, what was it like to be in the research, be a part of the research, and also step away as a journalist? So I was curious how you were able to merge that.
You know, I really felt an obligation to tell a story that really hadn't been told. Like, lots of people have written about the Harlem Renaissance, but I wanted to talk about the people and the social life, and the social life not in a frivolous way, but, you know, the impact that it had on politics and that it had on culture. So I wanted to, you know, being a journalist just means for me that it's like you've got to have facts. And I had this moment when I was a graduate student at Columbia in journalism, when I went back to Indianapolis for Christmas, and my mom had lung cancer. She was terminal, but at 23, that, you know, I didn't really process what that meant. But I told her that I was working on this paper. Phil Garland, the only black woman on the faculty at Columbia J School at the time, told me that that's what I had to write about. But I went back and I said, you know, Mommy, I'm finding like Madam Walker's not perfect, and you know, there's like she had a divorce, okay, like, but you know, but whatever. I was like, so I'm finding things, and she's in her hospital bed, and I'm telling her, you know, how this is going, and I said, but you know, what should I do about that? What should I do about those stories? And she said, tell the truth, baby. It's all right to tell the truth. And that has really guided me as I have written the books that I've written. But I also feel an obligation to future generations to really tell the story. You know, none of these books were in my high school history library, in my high school library, and so I want to write these books for the next generation.
That's fantastic. Think about that time period and black architects, that they were able to make relationships with finding the right architect for the dream home. And you explain anything about how that research, or they're part of the party scene, or how does she find the...
Well, you know, I mean, I think that when we think about the parties of the Harlem Renaissance, and the parties were important, but Harlem was really ground zero for all of these, for many educated African Americans. Obviously, everybody is not, you know, an educated college graduate who's living in Harlem. There are a lot of other people who are here, this great migration. But there was a core group of people like Philip Payton, who was a realtor, like John E. Nail, and who had relationships with people all over the city who were doing real estate deals. And we don't, you know, don't think about that, but they were making a real difference. And then Vertner Tandy, who was one of the first licensed black architects in New York, had designed St. Philip's Episcopal Church. And so he now was the premier black architect, and that's who A'Lelia Walker hired to combine two townhouses that were on 136th Street. That's who Madam Walker hired to design Villa Lawaro. So that's, you know, you hire the best. The best of everything is, you know.
That's what I find so fascinating about how you have redefined the archive of black women, about black business, and then think about the slippery space between the fact and the fiction, and still archive making and telling the story. It's a powerful story, but then when we think about pop culture today, how do we talk about activism and then also finding the right architect, you know, the connecting to churches, but also connecting to a villa in Italy. So how is that story told? So how do you reimagine that experience? And then my final question, well, two final, well, who were her mentors? And then how, in terms of black women stories, find these prominent spaces in social life and activism? And so if you can combine those two.
You know, when I think about that, thank goodness Deb did let me know some of the questions, because I'd never thought about, you know, who her mentors were, and her mother was her mentor. I mean, there's nobody else that I can think of, because she went to school for a little while, but she did, you know, she dropped out of Knoxville College, and then it was always her mother who was kind of the center of her universe in that way. You know, Mr. Ransom, F.B. Ransom, who was the attorney and general manager of the company, was more her contemporary, though he was much stricter than she was, and so set the tone, and so in some ways created some guardrails. But that's not really mentoring. I think it's her mother who's her mentor. But then she had lots of interesting friends. Edna Lewis Thomas, who became a famous actress, who was in Streetcar Named Desire and who was in Black Macbeth. But she had been Madam Walker's social secretary, and she and A'Lelia were very good friends. Jerry Major, Bessie Beard, and Lucille Green Randolph, A. Philip Randolph's wife, was a Walker-trained beautician. You know, when you mentioned Tiffany Gill, just in terms of legacy, Tiffany Gill's book, Black Beauty Shop Politics, she talks about how the beauticians were politically powerful. And it was Lucille Green Randolph, who was the president of the Walker Beauty Club in New York, whose husband created the March on Washington in 1963. But as Tiffany Gill talks about, it was the beauticians, many of the beauticians who helped pay for the buses that went to the March on Washington. But those political seeds were planted in Madam Walker's 1917 convention of her agents when she told them, your first duty is to humanity.
That's fascinating. One last thought when you said that, I was just thinking about the opportunity that you had to create this book, design this book, but also to allow your reader to walk through history through just the everyday experience, but then also through fashion. And she was a fashion icon.
She was.
And I'm curious in terms of I became fictionalized. I began to think about how she could walk through Paris and just design, finding those mink coats and finding that look. So that's when I'm thinking about mentors. I was thinking about some of the that fashion houses of the time.
Well, I mean, you're right. And so, yes, she did learn. And I think, the fashion thing, I think it's a combination of where did she pick some of that up. Some of it was the church ladies at St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. Some of it was the madams and the bordellos on Market Street in St. Louis. She saw this flamboyance, from an early age. But her sense of fashion, once she and Madam Walker both, once they had money, they liked to indulge themselves in clothes, beautiful clothes, many that were designed by Black designers. And when some people criticized A'Lelia Walker for the very extravagant wedding that she staged for my grandmother, her retort was all of the designers were Black, including Mildred Blount, who had later designed the headdresses, later designed the hats for Gone with the Wind.
Great.
So yes, you're right. And she knew Paul Poiret. She visited his studio in Paris.
It's fascinating. I'd like to open up for questions, just as we mentioned earlier, questions, and if you have any, there are 2 mics in the back. If you'd like to stand and.
Hi, Dr. Willis.
Hi.
I have a question in regards to the research process and how you lended yourself to things that you sort of subconsciously were aware of, as opposed to things that you were completely unfamiliar with. Like, what were moments that shocked you during that process?
I've been working on this for so long. I don't know that there was anything I wasn't aware of, but the process of reading A'Lelia Walker's letters, I mean, we are really lucky that Madam Walker was smart enough, prescient enough to hire a really great executive team who kept the letters. Those letters have now been digitized, and so they're quite accessible. But just immersing myself in those letters was important. The opportunity, the privilege of having the chance to interview some of the Harlem Renaissance survivors when they were still living in the early 80s, when I was really starting to do the research, gave me a human dimension that was something that was taking something off the page. I think one of the things that I wasn't surprised so much about, but that I was able to affirm, is that A'Lelia Walker really was a patron of the arts. And there are some things that have been written that sort of say, oh, she really didn't have time, she didn't really give very much money. But I found many ways. She raised money for an ambulance for the troops in France during World War I. And one of the ways that she did that, which was such a signature for her, is that she hosted an event and invited Enrico Caruso, the famous Italian tenor, to be kind of the cameo celebrity. And even though ultimately he wasn't able to come because he'd overtaxed his throat, it sold out the house. And they were able to use that money to buy the ambulance. Then later she helped raise money for a community center. And then just having her homes, opening up her homes in a place where people felt comfortable, people from uptown and downtown, at a time when there were very few spaces where Black and white people hung out together. She was welcoming to a wide range of people. And so that it didn't surprise me, but just sort of getting the facts and the documentation helped me to really tell that story.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jerry, and this is amazing how life travels around like this. In the early 90s, I was at the Madam C.J. Walker Theater and didn't know who Madam C.J. Walker was. I was operations manager of a theater company called Living a Dream, and we did a play called Our Young Black Men Are Dying, Nobody Seems to Care. And we were in the theater, and I remember standing on the stage. It had to be about 20-something years ago. And I said, well, where we at? They said, where we at the Madam C.J. Walker Theater? I said, oh, that's the hair lady. I want to thank you for coming and sharing the history, because now I know more now. She was more than just a hair lady. She was a very respected, very rich, very elegant woman. And she was an AME like my mother. So all AMEs, I understand that. I'm an AME baby. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I would just say this about the AME Church. It was so critical and pivotal for Madam Walker's development. As I said earlier, it was the women of the church who really gave her this vision of herself. Like, she was still a washerwoman, but she volunteered with the Missionary Society. She sang in the choir. And it was those women who mentored Madam Walker. Mm-hmm. And so that was really critical for her development. And I think I try to tell that story, and I'm glad that you keyed in on it as well.
Thanks.
Hi, ladies. Harriet Cole here.
Hi, Harriet.
Hello. I want you to tell us about your background, and Deb mentioned it a little bit, and how it has informed the storytelling. Because everything that builds our lives helps us to where we are today, and the writing is cinematic.
Thank you.
You take us into these experiences, as you described, Deb, the reimagining. You guide us into these experiences so we can see what life was like in the Harlem Renaissance. Most of us don't know, and most of the things that are written are not written in this way. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about the background that is yours that helped to set the stage for this book?
Thank you, Harriet. So, the last thing I thought I would be doing at this stage in my life is being immersed in the Walker women. When I was growing up, that's what my parents did. That was not who I was. But the silverware that we used every day had Madam Walker's monogram. The baby grand piano on which I learned to play music had been in Alelia Walker's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. So I was surrounded by these things. I would go with my mother to the Madam Walker building. She was vice president of the company, and I would go with her to the factory where the ladies were still mixing the products by hand, or to the drugstore when my grandfather managed it and I could get 2 ice cream cones and not just one. So I did grow up surrounded by things, by the Walker story, but I wanted to be my own person. I mean, it was like, again, the last thing I thought I would do. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a writer. But when I got to Columbia, and Phyllis Garland, listened to my boring topics, and she said, your name is Alelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker? And I said, yeah, that's my family. She said, well, that's what you're going to write about. So it was important to me. And then I needed somebody to validate it for me. Nobody in 1975 was saying, oh, we need a book about Madam Walker. In fact, if you tried to write a dissertation at a major university, they would have said, well, that's not really that important. So it took someone to tell me it was important. And then having learned that it was important, having it validated, as a journalist, I really wanted to do my best in telling the story, and I realized the impact that Madam Walker had had on so many women during her lifetime, helping them become economically independent, helping them buy real estate and educate their children. And so now I see the inspiration that it gives to others, and so it makes me want to tell the story in a readable way.
Great, thank you. We have a question here, and the last question on the right.
Yeah, I'm Eric K. Washington.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Eric.
Considering, I mean, you've been working on this, researching it for the longest time.
As long as I've known you.
Right, and longer, and living it for even longer. There must be questions that you're asked ad infinitum about A'Lelia Walker. Is there an essential question or some essential questions that you don't get asked, that you wonder, why isn't anybody asking me that?
No, I don't know. I guess there's no, I think one of the things that people will learn from this book is more about the relationship between Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker, the devotion, but also the complicated relationships. It's just, why does she never have the happy marriage? That's sort of the personal part. I think people don't necessarily assume that she had a great business mind, but she did. She just didn't have the same perseverance as her mother, but she was, very much a person who knew how to put on an event. She would have been a great influencer now. People get paid to do party planning. She knew how to plan a great event, and it was the combination of people and great food and a venue and great drink. She knew all of that, but she pulled it off better than anybody else.
Our final question.
Hi, I really enjoyed it. And as a Black woman working in a male-dominated field, representing clients, I represented a person who was researching his grandfather's story, who was the first Black millionaire in Ohio, Alonzo Gordon Wright. So I, in that research, stumbled on Madam C.J. Walker. I had seen and read the book, but it was only not a lot of millionaires at that time that were of color. It was amazing. I think it was less than 12. And then I also, have a client who is a celebrity client, Mike Coulter, who plays Luke Cage, who is launching a product right now, hair care product. And so I said that to say, as a woman, that even today has a hard time finding financing for people, especially of color and women. I just, in your research, what do you think her motivation was, and what was the thing that kept her going? Because there's so many obstacles even today. So just think about what it had to be like then, for things to just stand in the way, or even people that take your ideas.
Her motivation was her daughter. I mean, that really, just like parents today, she wanted her daughter's life to be better. I mean, I think that was the core. But then, as time went on and she began to develop the business, she developed a hair care product, and it solved a problem. It solved a problem that many Black women were having with hair loss because of scalp infections. But in some ways, I think the hair care products became a means to an end, because she saw what economic independence could do for women. As her agent, she was training thousands of women all over the United States, so that by the time she had this convention in 1917, at what really had to have been one of the first national conventions of women entrepreneurs, women were telling her stories about educating their children and buying homes, and she gave prizes not just to the women who sold the most products, but to the women who had given the most to charity. She told them, your first duty is to humanity. And then she married that with political activism. And at the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. So it starts out with the motivation for wanting her daughter's life to be better. And then she saw this big impact that she could have on thousands of other women and on her community.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to have this moment. Yes, great.
Thank you, Casey.
Oh no, we want to get guys up here some books and take some photos.
Okay.
All right.
And then where can they sign books?
We are going to sign books out in Langston Hughes Lobby.
Okay.
Oops.